You really think someone like you can afford to eat here? The hostess smirked, her eyes fixed on Marcus's simple knit sweater. Marcus didn't flinch. Not from shock, he was used to being judged by the color of his skin. A slow breath, a calm gaze. But something in his eyes made her pause. That night at Meridian Prime, Chicago's most exclusive fine dining restaurant, where tailored suits and status were the only languages spoken, Marcus stepped in wearing jeans and a plain sweater. His presence alone was a quiet act of defiance. He hadn't even pulled out the chair when a young waitress approached, hands trembling as she laid down the menu, avoiding his eyes. The manager hovered nearby as if waiting for the slightest misstep to strike. Marcus offered a soft smile. "I'm just here to order." The manager's voice cut through the air, louder than necessary. "Are you even aware how much the Wagyu steak costs here?" The room fell silent for a beat. Heads turned. Someone let out a low chuckle. Who really doesn't belong here?" She glanced at her phone briefly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a knowing smile. There was something in that moment, something that suggested Julie Blake carried secrets far beyond her CEO title, secrets that would soon turn this encounter into something none of them could imagine. The weight of walking where every eye screamed you're unwelcome pressed down on her shoulders, but she carried it with the dignity of someone who had learned to transform prejudice into power. Her fingers brushed against the phone in her pocket, already calculating the moves that would follow this opening gambit. Julie moved through the shop with deliberate calm, her casual jeans and hoodie a stark contrast to the polished rifles lining the walls. The metal surfaces gleamed coldly under the flickering lights, their reflections dancing across the scratched glass cases below. She had chosen her outfit carefully. Nothing that would immediately scream wealth or power, nothing that would give away the fact that she commanded a tech empire worth hundreds of millions. The air hung thick with the scent of gun oil and accumulated dust, while beneath her feet, the creaky floorboards groaned with each step, as if the building itself was protesting her presence. Her humble appearance masked a truth that would have stunned everyone in the room. Julie Blake was the CEO of Tech Forward Solutions, a major tech firm whose innovations had revolutionized 3 different industries. She commanded a fortune that dwarfed the annual revenue of this entire strip mall, employed over 15,000 people across 6 countries, and had been named to Fortune's Most Powerful Women list 3 years running. But even more than that, she carried a deeper secret, one that would soon reshape everything these people thought they knew about power and consequence. Rick Morrison watched her browse the shelves, his whispered commentary to his employees carrying clearly across the small space. "People like her don't belong in here," he muttered, his voice echoing off the faded wooden panels that had witnessed decades of similar prejudice. Always looking for trouble, always trying to prove something. His words were punctuated by the nervous laughter of his staff. Young men who had learned their bigotry from mentors like Rick. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. The way they spoke about her, as if she weren't standing just feet away, as if her humanity was somehow diminished by their assumptions. When a white customer entered moments later, the transformation was immediate and telling. Rick's demeanor shifted completely. Warm smile, helpful tone, even a discount offered without being requested. "Welcome to Morrison's Firearms," he said with genuine enthusiasm, his voice carrying none of the hostility that had greeted Julie. "What can I help you find today? We've got a special running on hunting rifles this week." The favoritism was so blatant it was almost comical, if it weren't so deeply painful. Julie observed every slight, her grip tightening on the pen in her pocket like a silent anchor. Her eyes caught the Confederate flag sticker prominently displayed on the counter, positioned where every customer would have to see it. She noted how customers seemed to brush past her deliberately, their coats rustling as they avoided even accidental contact. The message was clear and coordinated. This was their space and she was trespassing. The favoritism continued as Julie's questions about firearms were dismissed with barely concealed irritation. "Look, lady, these aren't toys," Rick said when she asked about a particular rifle's specifications. "Maybe you should start with something simpler." Meanwhile, the white customer received detailed explanations about ammunition types, maintenance requirements, and shooting techniques. The injustice of it all settled over the shop like a heavy blanket. But Julie's dignity remained intact, even as her mind began calculating the cost of such blindness. The hum of the flickering neon sign outside provided an oddly fitting soundtrack as Julie approached the counter with a specific inquiry about a firearm. Her voice remained steady, professional, cutting through the stale air with quiet authority. "I'd like to know more about that rifle," she said, pointing to a display model that caught her eye. "What's the effective range, and what type of scope mounting system does it use?" The questions were precise, technical, revealing knowledge that clearly surprised Rick. Rick's response was immediate and predictable. "You sure you know how to handle one of these?" The question dripped with condescension, his tone suggesting that her very presence in the shop was some kind of mistake. "These aren't the kind of guns you see in movies, sweetheart. They pack real power." The endearment was delivered like an insult, followed by the kind of snickering from his employees that spoke of shared assumptions and comfortable prejudice. Their boots scuffed against the worn floor as they gathered closer, like vultures sensing opportunity. Julie's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained level. "I'm quite familiar with firearms," she replied, her tone carrying just enough steel to suggest there was more to her than met the eye. "I was asking about the technical specifications." Inside, memories surfaced unbidden. The diner rejection when she was just 17, refused service for no reason other than the color of her skin. The manager had looked at her with the same dismissive contempt, as if her very existence was an affront to the established order. That wound had never fully healed, instead transforming into fuel for a resolve that had carried her through decades of success and struggle. The humiliation of that moment had taught her that dignity was not given but claimed, and she had been claiming it ever since. Every boardroom conquest, every acquisition, every moment of triumph had been built on the foundation of that teenage girl's determination to prove that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. The staff's behavior escalated with practiced ease. They ignored her direct questions, laughing behind the display case of gleaming pistols, their amusement echoing off the cramped walls. One employee, a young man with greasy hair and a smirk that suggested he'd found his calling as a professional bigot, made a show of helping other customers while pointedly avoiding Julie's gaze. The message was clear. She could wait, indefinitely if necessary, because her time and dignity were worthless in this space. A customer, emboldened by the staff's attitude, leaned in close enough that Julie could smell the tobacco on his breath. "What exactly are your intentions here?" he asked, his coat rustling as he positioned himself deliberately in her personal space. The question carried undertones of suspicion and threat, as if her presence required justification that went beyond the simple desire to make a purchase. His eyes held the kind of hostility that had become all too familiar, the look of someone who had decided that her existence was somehow problematic. Julie's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. The message was from her assistant, probably wondering why she was running late for her next meeting. If only they knew she was currently being subjected to the kind of treatment that would have made headline news if it happened to someone more obviously powerful. The shop's claustrophobic atmosphere pressed in around her, thick with prejudice and the kind of casual cruelty that had become all too familiar. The doorbell jangled again as more customers entered, their conversations dying as they took in the scene playing out before them. The confrontation reached a new level of audacity when Rick stepped out from behind the counter, his voice carrying clearly across the shop. "We don't serve your kind here unless you prove you're legit," he announced, the words echoing off the splintered walls like a declaration of war. The customers stared from beneath the dusty ceiling fan, some with obvious approval, others with uncomfortable silence. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. "Your kind," the phrase hung in the air like a curse, carrying with it the weight of centuries of discrimination. Julie felt the familiar sting of those words, the way they reduced her to nothing more than a stereotype, a problem to be solved or a threat to be neutralized. She had heard variations of this phrase in corporate boardrooms, at country clubs, in exclusive restaurants where her presence was tolerated but never welcomed. Julie's voice remained steady as she requested to speak with the owner. "I'd like to understand your policies," she said, her tone giving nothing away. Internally, the slurs cut deep, each word a fresh echo of the diner rejection and countless corporate microaggressions that had marked her climb to success. She felt the weight of every black professional who had been judged unfairly, every person who had been told they didn't belong, but she channeled that pain into resolve. This was bigger than just her. This was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small by people who mistook prejudice for power. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, but she maintained her dignity with practiced grace. "Could you provide me with your written policies?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of formality that seemed to surprise Rick. The request was reasonable, logical, and completely within her rights as a potential customer, but it also carried an undertone of challenge that made Rick's eyes narrow with suspicion. The staff's laughter bounced off the glass cases, their amusement feeding on what they perceived as her naivety. "Written policies?" Rick repeated, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Lady, our policy is simple. We serve real Americans who respect this country and know their place. You got a problem with that?" The threat was barely veiled, his stance shifting to something more aggressive as he spoke. Rick's response came wrapped in the language of procedure, but the discrimination was thinly veiled. "Store policy," he said with obvious satisfaction, his chest puffing out with the kind of pride that came from exercising power over someone he perceived as powerless. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone we consider suspicious. And you, lady, are acting mighty suspicious." The doorbell clanked as a customer exited, smirking at what they clearly viewed as entertainment, rather than a human being's dignity being trampled. Julie discreetly sent a text to someone identified only as legal team in her contacts, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. The message was brief but loaded with implications. Need state contact. Discrimination in progress. Location attached. Federal task force protocols in effect. She had learned long ago that documentation was power, and power was about to shift dramatically in this small-town gun shop. Another message went to her security team, alerting them to her location and status. The atmosphere in the shop grew increasingly hostile as Rick called his employees to watch the situation. "Keep an eye on her," he instructed loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed he was protecting his territory from an invasion. "Suspicious behavior, if you ask me. Can't be too careful these days." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, the wooden walls seeming to close in as customers began to crowd near a rack of hunting gear, their coats rustling with anticipation. What Julie witnessed next was a masterclass in systemic bias, executed with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of long practice. The staff began citing discriminatory store policy that was clearly designed to target non-white customers. Their procedures wrapped in the language of safety and security, but transparently motivated by prejudice. "We require 2 forms of ID for certain customers," one employee explained with a straight face, as if this were perfectly reasonable, plus a local reference and a background check that goes beyond the federal requirement. Rick boasted openly about keeping the shop safe, his voice sharp against the constant hum of the refrigerator in the corner. "We've got a reputation to maintain in this community," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who believed he was defending civilization itself. "Can't just let anyone walk in here and expect to be treated like they own the place." Julie's frustration reached its peak, her mind flashing once again to that diner rejection that had pushed her to prove her worth to a world that questioned her right to exist in certain spaces. She began recording the interaction with her phone, her movements careful and deliberate. The video would serve as evidence, but more than that, it would serve as a record of the kind of treatment that millions of Americans faced every day simply for existing, while black. Another text went out, this one to someone identified as State Contact, with the message, "Discrimination documented, federal implications, task force advisor status confirmed, need immediate response." The message was encrypted, routed through secure channels that few people had access to. Julie Blake was not just a CEO, she was a covert advisor to a federal anti-discrimination task force, her business success providing the perfect cover for her real work. The situation took on a life of its own when a customer began filming, their phone capturing what they clearly believed would be viral content. They framed Julie as a troublemaker, their narrative already forming before the incident was even over. "Y'all seeing this?" they said into their phone, live streaming to their followers. "Some woman came in here acting like she owns the place, and now she's trying to cause problems for honest business owners." The shop's flickering neon sign provided the perfect backdrop for their distorted version of events. The social media post began spreading immediately, comments flooding in from viewers who had never met Julie but were quick to judge based on assumptions and prejudice. "Typical," wrote one commenter. "Always playing the victim?" Another added, "These people always looking for trouble." The digital pile-on was swift and merciless, fueled by the kind of hatred that thrived in anonymous online spaces. The tension in the shop had become suffocating. Customers whispered among themselves, their conversations a mixture of excitement and discomfort. Some were clearly enjoying the spectacle, while others seemed uncertain about what they were witnessing. The employees glared openly, their hostility feeding off Rick's leadership and the crowd's energy. The very air seemed thick with hostility, as if the building itself had become a pressure cooker of prejudice and rage. Julie's composed facade began to crack, her eyes burning with a combination of fury and determination that had been building for decades. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been made to feel unwelcome in places where they had every right to be. The weight of representation pressed down on her shoulders, the knowledge that how she handled this moment would affect not just her own dignity, but the dignity of everyone who looked like her. As Rick threatened to call the police, his voice rising with each word, Julie's phone rang. The sound cut through the shop's hostile atmosphere like a sword, the ringtone somehow managing to command attention in a way that her voice had not. When she answered, her voice carried a note of formality that seemed to surprise everyone present. "This is Julie Blake," she said, the words carrying weight that none of them yet understood. The simple introduction somehow shifted the energy in the room, as if the very air had changed. The voice on the other end was crisp, official, and loud enough to be heard throughout the small shop. "Ms. Blake, this is Assistant Attorney General Sarah Chen. We've received your report and are prepared to take immediate action." The words fell like bombs in the silence that followed, each syllable reshaping the power dynamic in the room. Suddenly, the woman they had been tormenting was speaking to someone with real authority, someone who could make their lives very difficult. The confirmation of her CEO status came next, delivered in the kind of bureaucratic language that carried undeniable weight. "Ms. Blake, we've verified your position as Chief Executive Officer of Tech Forward Solutions and your advisory role with the Federal Anti-Discrimination Task Force. Your report has been flagged for immediate investigation under federal hate crime statutes." The words hung in the air like a judgment, transforming Julie from victim to prosecutor in the span of a single phone call. Julie's corporate ID appeared in her hand like a magic trick, followed by a sealed letter bearing the governor's official seal. The paper was crisp and formal against the shop's dusty counter, its official weight impossible to ignore. "I believe you'll find everything in order," she said, her voice now carrying the calm authority of someone who had just revealed their true power. The transformation was complete. The woman they had dismissed as a troublemaker was now revealed as someone who could destroy them all. The shop fell silent except for the sound of Rick's labored breathing. His face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks as the implications began to sink in. The employees looked like deer caught in headlights, their earlier bravado evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. Customers began backing toward the door, suddenly eager to distance themselves from what was clearly about to become a very public disaster. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Julie's voice cut through the shop's stunned silence as she placed a call to a corporate hotline, her tone calm but commanding. "This is Julie Blake, CEO of Tech Forward Solutions. I need to report a discrimination incident at one of our subsidiary locations." The words fell like hammer blows, each one reshaping the power dynamic in the room. The casual mention of subsidiary location hit Rick like a physical blow. His shop was part of a larger chain, and Julie Blake effectively owned him. "The location identifier is Echo 77 Charlie," Julie continued, reading from a small card she had pulled from her wallet. "I need immediate termination protocols initiated and a full federal investigation launched." Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. This was not a request. It was a command from someone who had every right to give it. Rick and his employees stood frozen, their faces pale with the dawning realization of what they had stumbled into. The woman they had spent the last hour tormenting was not just a customer. She was their ultimate boss, someone who could end their careers with a single phone call. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, but the evidence was undeniable. Customers gasped audibly, some fumbling for their phones to capture this unexpected reversal, while others headed for the door with embarrassed haste. The doorbell jangled frantically as people fled, leaving behind a scene that none of them had anticipated. The customer who had been live streaming suddenly found himself documenting his own complicity in what was clearly going to become a federal case. The Attorney General's voice on speaker stunned the room into complete silence. "Ms. Blake, we're prepared to launch a full investigation based on your report. Federal discrimination laws have clearly been violated, and we'll be pursuing this under both civil rights statutes and federal hate crime legislation." The words carried the weight of the federal government, transforming a small-town dispute into a national incident. Julie's focus remained on customer rights and human dignity, her tone remaining humane even as she wielded power that dwarfed everyone else in the room. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her voice carrying across the shop with quiet authority. "This is about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I've experienced here today. Every American deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race, religion, or background." Her dual identity, CEO and federal task force advisor, added shocking weight to every word she spoke. The task force position was classified, known only to a select few in government and law enforcement. Her role was to identify and document discrimination in real-world settings, gathering evidence that would be used to strengthen federal protections and prosecute violators. Rick Morrison and his employees had just provided her with a textbook case. Internally, she felt the vindication of decades of struggle, tempered by the knowledge of how much prejudice had cost her and countless others. This moment was the culmination of every slight, every microaggression, every time she had been told she didn't belong. The teenage girl who had been refused service at that diner would have been amazed to see what she had become. Not just successful, but powerful enough to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure what she had endured. The collapse came swiftly and publicly. Julie's phone buzzed with an email from corporate headquarters, and she read it aloud to the assembled crowd. Effective immediately, Rick Morrison is terminated from his position for violation of company policy and federal discrimination laws. All employees who participated in or witnessed discriminatory behavior without reporting it are also terminated. A formal apology will be posted on all company websites and social media platforms within the hour. The words cut through the shop's tense silence like a blade, each syllable carrying the weight of consequence. Rick's face went from pale to ashen, his hands trembling as the reality of his situation hit him. Not only was he fired, but his behavior had been documented and would be part of a federal investigation. His reputation in the firearms industry was destroyed, his career effectively over. An apology appeared on the company website within minutes, the shop's laptop glowing with the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Tech Forward Solutions and its subsidiary, Morrison Firearms, deeply regret the discriminatory treatment experienced by our CEO, Julie Blake, at our retail location. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form and have taken immediate action to address this situation. We are committed to ensuring that all customers are treated with dignity and respect. Rick faced not just termination, but industry blacklisting and federal investigation. The firearms industry was small and tightly knit. Word would spread quickly that he had been fired for discriminating against his own ultimate boss. No reputable dealer would hire him, and the federal investigation would follow him wherever he went. His employees faced similar consequences, their careers in the industry effectively over. The customers who had supported Rick's behavior began filing out, their coats rustling with shame and embarrassment. Some tried to delete the social media posts they had made, but the internet never forgets. Their faces had been captured on Julie's recording, their complicity documented for posterity. The shop fell silent except for the sound of Rick's stammering attempts at apology, his words echoing off the creaky floorboards that had witnessed his downfall. "I'm sorry," Rick whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I wouldn't have, if I'd known who you were." His words trailed off as he realized how they sounded. He was apologizing not for his behavior, but for not recognizing her power. The apology was hollow, motivated by fear rather than genuine remorse. Justice had arrived with swift and decisive force, transforming the space from a den of prejudice into a classroom of consequence. Julie watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, her composure intact as the reality of the situation settled over everyone present. The shop's wooden walls had witnessed more than just commerce. They had seen the cost of prejudice and the power of standing up for what was right. As the chaos subsided, Julie addressed the remaining staff and customers, her voice resonating against the shop's wooden walls with the authority of someone who had transformed pain into purpose. She spoke of the prejudice that had marked her journey, including that defining moment at the diner when she was 17, and the countless microaggressions that had shaped her resolve to create change. Her words carried the weight of experience and the promise of action. "I want you to understand something," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the shop. "This isn't about me being powerful or wealthy. This is about basic human dignity. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. That's not just good business. It's what it means to be human. No one should feel unwelcome for who they are," she continued, her words carrying the weight of experience and the promise of action. "We rise by lifting each other, not by tearing each other down. Prejudice doesn't make you strong, it makes you weak. It blinds you to the humanity in others and ultimately diminishes your own." She pledged to fund anti-discrimination initiatives, her voice steady and inspiring as she spoke of turning individual pain into collective progress. The remaining customers nodded, some tearful as they absorbed the lesson playing out before them. Under the dusty ceiling fan, in the flickering light of the old fluorescent bulbs, Julie Blake had transformed a space of hatred into a moment of hope. She felt pride in her ability to turn pain into purpose, to use power not for revenge but for justice. The transformation was complete. Predator had become prey, victim had become victor, and prejudice had been exposed for what it truly was. A young employee who had remained silent throughout the confrontation stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I want you to know that not all of us, I never agreed with how things were done here. I was just afraid to speak up." His words carried the weight of regret and the promise of change. Julie nodded, understanding that courage sometimes came in small steps. Julie exited the shop with her head held high, the rusty doorbell clanking one final time as she stepped into the afternoon sunlight. Behind her, the shop's neon sign flickered like a beacon, marking the spot where power had shifted and justice had prevailed. The change she had demanded was already beginning, rippling outward from this small-town gun shop into a larger conversation about dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up for what was right. As she walked toward her car, Julie felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This hadn't been planned. She had simply stopped to make a purchase and had instead found herself in the middle of a civil rights incident. But that was how change often happened. Not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people refusing to accept extraordinary injustice. The teenage girl who had been refused service at that diner would have been proud of the woman she had become. The story was far from over, but the first chapter had been written in the most unlikely of places, proving that change could come from anywhere when courage met opportunity and power was wielded with purpose. Julie Blake had shown them exactly how justice was claimed, not given, and the lesson would echo far beyond the walls of that small gun shop. The revolution had begun with a single word: no.